All right, let's talk a little bit about how we can figure out what themes are present within a collection of text. And we're going to do that in two ways, very briefly on each of these, just to kind of give you a flavor for what it might feel like and look like. One is traditional kind of qualitative thematic analysis, and the second is sort of topic modeling writ large, clustering text and then modeling it. Among humanists, that might be called deep reading on one hand and distant reading on the other. But more generally, what we're trying to do is find patterns throughout a text, either using ourselves as an interpreter in the case of a qualitative approach, or drawing on kind of statistical differences found within the collection to pull it into clusters. And then again, we have to step into that interpretive role and figure out why do these statistical differences occur? Why what makes these clusters matter if they do? So let's start with the qualitative approach, and this is found particularly in humanities, but also in the social sciences. And honestly, it's a very common sort of practice. The idea is that you're trying to not just summarize sort of as a whole. I'm not just giving you a summary of what's there. I am trying to, or rather, multiple summaries, like I'm summarizing different people that I've interviewed, for example. I'm not just doing that or giving you an overall. I talk to a bunch of people and they generally like it. I mean, that's not very useful. And so I'm really trying to use it as an analytical tool to pull things apart a little bit and into useful categories. A lot of times when we're putting together a research question, it is a question of, something like a grid, right? I have two outcomes. What kinds of inputs appear more likely on one side or the other? So, I mean, for example, if I'm looking at interactions between a doctor and a patient, and then I have a score from the patient afterwards about how much the patient felt they were valued, right? This is a terrible sort of outcome metric, but let's just say we have that. Can we find themes that the doctor touches on, some things that are patterns that repeat? And are there things that tend to repeat more heavily on the side of patients who are satisfied with their care, or patterns that seem to occur more commonly among those who are dissatisfied with their care, right? So you've got this sort of, can we split it between things, and then can we find, we might call them facets or patterns that show up on one side or the other. It's a very common way to start to think about structuring a research question in a way that's answerable, right? So one of the ways we do this is by using some approaches, and there are actually a plethora of approaches, many of which I am not familiar with, to be honest. I've talked with some of my colleagues who use very specialized forms of this kind of qualitative thematic analysis, but I can give you some broad strokes that seem to appear across all of them. And the broken record part, we start by defining the research question in the data set. Research question we've talked about already quite a bit, but we really want to think about sort of, when we think about our data set, we need to think about whether the data set's going to be able to answer our question. And so we want to make sure, generally when you're doing this kind of thematic analysis, you're looking at questions that are exploratory rather than sort of predictive. You're looking for things that will help you to understand a topic more broadly, or at least understand how those who are responding to you, or how the text answers that question. And so we need to make sure that we're picking a data set that can answer that. For hypothesis testing, it would be a different kind of data set in many cases, but we really are looking for a data set that allows people to describe and present an experience of a phenomenon in some way, so that you're getting sort of firsthand reports, or as in the case of the research question we're asking, sort of examples of interaction. So in this case, we want to find out how people are actually engaging in arguments in a stable setting where we are unobtrusive. One of the nice things about looking at text online is that we aren't asking people to respond. It's not interviews. The researcher can really kind of step back a bit, even though we're applying our own interpretive lens to this, which means that we're deeper in it than we would be for other kinds of ways of analyzing this data. It still means that we aren't actually involved in the process as much. And so it kind of gives us at least a little bit of distance from the conversations in this case, or the text itself in other cases, that we wouldn't have if we were looking at transcribed interviews or that sort of thing. In any case, we just need to make sure that the data that we're collecting, the corpus that we're collecting, is applicable to our problem. And that in the case where we're not kind of generating the text, in other words, if this hasn't been the outcome of a set of interviews or a particular ethnographic period of time at a particular site, actually in that case as well, we just need to be very explicit about where the data is coming from and why it is we've selected it. So, as it turns out, for the question I'm asking, I would have to go over to Reddit and tour around a little. And I did that and realized that these days on Reddit, people agree a whole lot. And I have some inklings as to why that may be. What it means is I can't just pick a random subreddit and have at it, because I'm not going to find people disagreeing with each other. Luckily, there are a number of fairly well-known subreddits where people intentionally go to disagree with one another. And some of these are kind of debate-oriented. And one of the most popular of these is something called Change My View. In that case, you present an argument, and then if someone gives you an argument, a counter argument to your your initial presentation and you find that in some way changes your view, you can actually mark it as saying, okay, yes, this, what you've said here actually does either completely, which is very rare, but at least makes me rethink my original position. And so this has a slight disadvantage because people are coming there with the intention of disagreeing and with the intention of disagreeing in such a way that they actually convince someone of something. And that's not always the reason people are disagreeing on the internet. In many cases, I suspect they're doing it for a bunch of different reasons, for entertainment or to feel in control, or because they can't disagree with people in their local environment without getting in trouble. So they go online as an outlet. I think there's lots of reasons. And so this does tend to shape things a bit, but it also gives us access to those discussions in a way that's useful. And so if I'm going to use that, I need to have something a lot more concise than what I just told you about my reasoning. And then I need to say, okay, so what is this collection? How have I selected this? We're not talking about kind of sample bias in the strict way we might be in a quantitative research approach. It's not, for example, a sample that we're trying to statistically infer, make inferences about a larger population. So the representativeness is not as kind of strictly confined, but I do need to talk about why I've selected this particular corpus and how I've set limits on it. And so for example, in this case, I might say that it was from a certain date for 1 year period, for example, and maybe I only pick those where there are a certain number of responses. There's some where nobody responds at all, at least initially. And there are some where there's not a lot of thread depth. And we've talked a little bit about thread depth elsewhere, but I'd like to choose one where people are actually talking back and forth enough that I can look at some of those dynamics. So I would have to explain that in very explicit detail about what is the corpus that I am kind of using here. The second step after having defined the research question and the corpus carefully is familiarizing yourself with the data. Now, this seems like a pretty obvious thing. You got to read the stuff. And the difference between sort of qualitative and quantitative approaches is really, and again, this is a depth-based approach, is that, if you have a large corpus of data and you're doing, say, some kind of qualitative work on it, whether it's framing analysis or anything else really, you need to read the stuff lots. You need to sit down and read it, and you have to expect that you're going to have to go through everything, multiple passes of reading this stuff. You can't just assume that you can read through it once and do a thematic analysis. And so we'd mentioned before that one of the advantages to hand coding your transcripts when you have interviews is that you actually do have to be in depth and look carefully at that as you're typing it out, right? So that gives you a chance to get your first read through as you're actually transcribing and typing what it is you hear or see. But whether or not you do that, you need to sit with the material and actually read through it without doing anything structural initially. Generally, there's a movie called Tampopo, and they discuss how you're supposed to address yourself to the ramen before you actually dive in and eat it. And
ある晴れた日、僕は一人の老人に伴われてふらりと町へ出た。小島さん。老人はラーメン歴40年。これから僕にラーメンの正しい食べ方を伝授してくれるのだという。先生、最初はスープからでしょうか、それとも麺からでしょうか。
最初はまずラーメンをよく見ます。
はい。
丼の全容をラーメンの湯気を吸い込みながらしみじみ鑑賞してください。スープの表面にキラキラと浮かぶ無数の。
So I usually think about this step as kind of addressing the ramen, looking at it, getting a feel for it before you ever dive into it. And so you kind of go through and you read it, and you might at some point, you might take some notes along the side, but you're just kind of trying to get a feel for what are some interesting factors here that might be worth looking at, the general kinds of differences, whether there's some broad commonalities. But at this point, you're really just trying to get yourself familiar with it. So when you encounter it in upcoming passes, you have a better feel for what it is you're seeing and what you might expect to see elsewhere in the corpus. The next step is to go through the third step is you're going through some kind of initial coding. And coding just means labeling segments of the text that might appear meaningful or relevant to the research question you've asked. I think we've talked about this. I don't think in any of the videos yet, but in encouraging you to do comments, we've talked about my former mentor at the University of Washington, Dick Carter, who had this thing called signaled stopping technique, where when you hit a point where you kind of stop in a reading, you mark why that is. And honestly, that's kind of what you're doing here too. If something kind of you're using yourself as the reflector for this, and how do you react as you're reading this? Does it give you a strong emotional reaction? It's kind of things that make you say huh, like if you're trying to heighten the likelihood that you'll go oh or huh or something like that, right? And when that happens, you need to kind of call it out. and it's some section of the text. You could highlight. You could do this with highlighters and labels. We'll talk about kind of the technique part of this, but you can start to do this as you're doing your initial coding by saying, okay, that's interesting. I wonder if that shows up more than once, right? Is this a pattern that might show up later? You might not really remember. Hopefully you've been through it once, so you might say, oh, that looks vaguely familiar. But this is where you start to kind of say, okay, I'm going to tag this. And generally what you're doing this as an inductive process. I think there are folks who go in planning to tag a corpus with a set of things that they're looking for specifically. But I think that probably the vast majority at this point of the published work I've seen that uses a qualitative approach like this does inductive coding. In other words, they start and just kind of begin with a set of tags, and you may be tagging a bunch of stuff that you never use those tags again. You may end up with a lot of singlet tags that you've just tagged it once and it doesn't really work. It doesn't show up as much as you thought it would, or it doesn't make as much sense. But in this initial one, it's kind of like a brainstorming session. You go through and you look for short phrases, maybe even single words, brief descriptions. In the case of conversation, it might be an exchange. You're trying to kind of stay pretty close at this point to the actual text and be able to kind of link back to it. So I might start to look through and see, okay, for example, if I'm looking at these Reddit arguments, I could look for, personal insults. I could look for how do they use evidence? Are there different kinds of evidence? Is there a claim to kind of personal experience or anecdote? Do they cite the scientific literature? Do they link to someone that has said something similar elsewhere in the conversation? Do they link to, sort of an expert or famous person that has said something that may be useful? Do they provide a quote to that in some way? Do they present a hypothetical? Do they appeal to the person's emotions directly? Do they say something along the lines of, kind of an identity claim? People who are like this say things like this. So you could start to go through and say, okay, I'm starting to see some of these things around here. You might do something that's a little bit more, I'd say, latent, which is to say, coding for examples of where you see the person getting frustrated or exhausted with the conversation, or we'll have to agree to disagree, right? In this particular subreddit, you could look for agreements of sort of, or kind of concessions. I see what you're saying and I agree with you there. So like that sort of either as a rhetorical strategy, which is I agree with you here, but yes, you're right. But, that sort of a rhetorical statement, or agreements, in a more fulsome way, I suppose. Yep, you got me on this. I was just wrong. I had this all wrong, and I appreciate you, usually with a thank you, right? I appreciate you with presenting this. There is a kind of a specific thing within Change My View, which is that there is a structural element where you're supposed to provide a delta, where you actually have a delta, you give a delta symbol to say, yes, you've changed my mind. And so in some sense, this particular corpus is slightly pre-tagged, which is useful, but you can come up with your own as well. How are you doing this? That's a really good question. So there are a small handful of tools that are supposed to help you engage in this kind of thematic analysis or qualitative analysis of text more broadly. I guess the most popular would probably be NVivo and Atlas TI. I've talked a little bit before that I've done some stuff. If you're working in a group, there is the newer kid on the block, which is a web-based tool called Deduce. So that's also a possibility. So should you go and get yourself a copy of NVivo or Atlas TI? And my feeling is no. When I was a graduate student, at one point I used both. I guess MaxQDA is also a popular one. I used both NVivo and Atlas TI. I was trying to figure out what tools would help me, and I thought, well, these are tools that are widely used, so if I could just pick them up, then that would be great. There are two disadvantages to this. Both of them actually, I think, more Atlas than NVivo, but both of them are structured in such a way that there's less flexibility for you to do what you do as an interpreter. So you really have to learn to use these tools. And because you have to learn to use them, you have to invest your time in using them, and then you tend to be stuck in them a little bit. And also they tend to have you do things in a particular way that is structured in the way the people that designed it thought you should do stuff. It's very ambiguous, I'm sure, but I found them to be constricting because of that. So that's one of the disadvantages. The other really big disadvantage is that they are expensive, and you may not feel that if the university is paying for all or some of them so that you have access to the tool now. But if you've invested all your time, this is why it's a little less expensive to get it at a university or as a student. Not a lot less expensive. I think because our unit does not have a blanket license for this, I think you're probably looking at several $100s. Well, it depends. Most things are moving to subscriptions now, but still several $100s a year then to have access to this. But then if you kind of have invested your time in learning how to use this and getting familiar with it and having it save you time, you'll have to end up paying for this later too. And so I don't like that buy-in to expensive tools if I can avoid it. So that's another negative. The positives are that it makes it easier to deal in many ways with the texts themselves. If you're not dealing with big data, if you're just dealing with medium to large size corpuses, if you have mixed data, all of these now do pretty well with dealing with audio data, video data, doing some of the transcription for you. Some of them have AI tools built into them. So they actually do some of the heavy lifting for you. And so they can be seductive for that reason and useful for that reason if you don't want to kind of deal with your own structure and system. So at the very high end, there's that. At the Luddite level, there is, you print all this out, you get tags, like you get, sticky notes, or you get, something like that. And you actually go through and you physically write by hand. I think that's actually not the best way to do it either, because collecting those tags, once you've done that tagging, once you've tried to start to establish those initial themes, is really very difficult. So that's not my go-to. There are a lot of people who will throw this into an Excel sheet, right? Because you can copy and paste over phrases or keys and then add your own tags in. And I don't do that, but I know people who have done that. So that is at least a possibility. I don't think that's the best way to do it either. I'm starting to run out of the best ways to do it. I've experimented a little bit with plain text files and with, as I said before, I'm using Obsidian, which actually makes this a little bit easier. You can use things like hashtags within the text itself, or brackets, right, to put your themes in. And then you can use tools on the back end that will extract those and automatically kind of pull them out. That's kind of like using the stickies on a physical piece of paper, but it doesn't, you can write tools that will do it automatically, or look for any page that has this hashtag on it, or any phrases that have these brackets or these hashtags on them. So that's kind of a between the extremes example. But it does require you to do a little bit more work on the back end to kind of pull these out and extract the themes, and then kind of basically reverse that so that you have an index to the themes that you create. Oh, then I'll back up to the next piece of this, which is often you're going through this multiple times, and you might decide that you don't need a particular tag for a theme, for example. And so you want to get rid of it. That's pretty straightforward. But what if you want to collapse two, for example? What if you've decided you've called it one thing and then you called it something else, but really these are too close and you just want to pull them together? Or what about the other way around? What if you have an overall theme and you want to do sub themes on that overall theme? There are tricky things you can do with naming your themes and that sort of thing. But tools like NVivo make that a little bit easier to kind of have hierarchies of tags, for example, if you're doing it that way. So once you have these codes set up, you're kind of moving from those codes up a level. And so the fourth step is to go from codes up to themes. And so themes are these broader patterns that may not be at the individual text level, but things that seem to emerge from multiple codes being used together. So I might be going through and tagging things that are about insults, provocations, something else like that. And these may kind of might be pulled together into a theme that I might call personal attacks or something like that, right? So basically, as you've tagged this at a very local level, where you have tags for individual pieces, even individual words, right? But maybe key phrases or something like that, then you need to start to build those up into themes that you can talk about, right? And then you might actually come up with some narrative kinds of themes. So it may not even be about you might have those personal attacks, and you might start to be making some connected pieces here. So like personal attacks as a response to a personal attack. Right? You might be able to start to say personal attacks because of other people personally attacking you, personal attacks because you are threatened in terms of status, personal attacks because there doesn't seem to be an obvious way to argue with a reference or with data. So like you might be able to start to make connections as to the actual reason or a larger kind of structure. Again, these don't have to be manifest; they could be latent. You could be reading into it a bit. You are using yourself as an interpreter here, but you can start to pull these together. These themes should be internally coherent. It should be pretty clear that they all hold together in some way. They should be distinct. As much as possible, distinct from one another. So if you have themes that are kind of intersecting and you don't have a very clear boundary between the two, you kind of have to rethink that a bit. And they shouldn't be a one-off, right? You should be able to, these are supposed to be patterns across your corpus, not just a single one. The fifth step in this process is sort of going through these themes and reviewing them and refining them. Does this, as you look through it, you kind of have these large themes. They're not just ready to spit out. You need to kind of return back to the data, read through it again. Does this theme accurately reflect what I have here? are there contradictions or exceptions? Am I kind of flattening down everything too much? Are the themes that I have too narrow, too broad? Am I missing something here in the process? You might at this point be thinking, do I need to split these up? Do I need to integrate them a bit more? Basically, you're just doing a rebalancing to make sure that you really have painted a thematic picture of the patterns that are appearing within the text. And so the final step in this is to write up a sort of the report piece of this, right? And you've been taking notes all along because you have a research notebook, and that's, even if you're not doing the actual tagging within that notebook, you should be keeping notes about what you're doing. And so that will help along the way, of course. But here's where you start to say, okay, what are my themes? Name the themes, make sure they have a clear name that will be legible not just to you, but to someone unfamiliar with the text. Give them a concise definition so that you clarify it even further. And then the key part here is, and you've seen this, I'm sure, in things you've read, is to pull out examples that will kind of illustrate your text. These are not supposed to be sort of definitive, right? They're supposed to provide, they're kind of a way of, like I said, illustrating examples of the themes you've found. And this is part of the fun part of working qualitatively with data. I do this as well when I'm doing quantitative work, because that process of illustrating it with the work you're doing is incredibly useful. So, for example, I did work on Reddit in terms of people making use of sort of lay epistemologies around things like ketogenic diets and makeup subreddits and things like that. And so being able to go in and say, here's the broad quantitative analysis, but then saying, okay, let's pick out some clear examples that give you a textured feel for what I'm talking about here. So it's not unique to a purely qualitative thematic analysis, but being able to bring out good examples is helpful. We may have touched on this before. This is where you need to think more seriously, even for text that is in an open forum like Reddit, about whether you are essentially decontextualizing those direct quotes. So if I use a direct quote from Reddit, all it takes is someone Googling that and they find out who wrote it, right? And anyone with even a little bit of experience with tracking online and making connections can probably connect that back to a real person, etc. And so you need to think about whether when you give these examples, they should be, especially when it's things like this, where you're bringing it from the web, you need to think about whether it makes sense to provide that direct quote. This is an ongoing discussion among people who think about the ethics of doing research online. And I started out in one camp and have gradually moved from it to this idea of using constructed quotes. And so that's a little bit weird. As long as you're being very explicit about the fact that these are not direct quotations, but your interpretation of the quotations, I think that's okay. Some of this can just be like, something in the style of, or mashing together two quotes and making them into one. You do have to be very explicit that you're not making stuff up here. You need to make sure you're recording this and that you've made a clear case in your own head about kind of that this is this is getting at the truth without getting at the exact truth, if that makes sense. And the idea behind this is, again, to protect the people that you're working with. In my case, I went the other way around, which is for my work on Reddit, I reached out to each of the people that I wanted to use direct quotes from and asked for their permission. So I kind of did this second step, and I said, do you want me to, may I use this quote in my paper? Do you want me to do one of three things? I can cite you, I can leave it anonymous, but be aware that people will probably be able to find it by Googling it. I can give them your Reddit name as the author, or I can give it your real life name as the author. All of them, in the case of this paper, as I recall, wanted it, were fine with me putting it in there and wanted it with their Reddit name kind of in it as well. So for me, that's been kind of the go-to. Now, I'm fine with people who do the constructed bit. I just don't think I trust myself enough to construct, if that makes sense. And so my preference has been, in those cases, to actually approach the people after the fact and say, I'd like to use this as an example in this paper. I'll give you a copy of the paper. You can see the context. You can pull it out before I submit it if you don't like it. But I have explicitly asked people for permission to use direct quotes. So this seems like it's a lot of mushiness, and that's always the way I feel about it too. But very briefly, to summarize, a thematic analysis basically means carefully and deeply engaging with the text, systematically but flexibly looking for patterns and extracting them by coding them, and then thoughtfully interpreting those codes into a thematic analysis. So, as you can see, a thematic analysis is a very human process. The human is not just in the loop, but you're looping through the text over and over again. You're reading it very closely, and it involves yourself as the instrument for understanding it, and that's great, because it works for even fairly large collections of text. But at some point, we run into the modern version of this, which is way too large for you to read through once, let alone iteratively. When we read texts, we read through them linearly. We start at the beginning and then go all the way through to the end and then go back to the beginning, and we do that again. But the texts themselves in large corpuses are often not really organized that way. I suppose for the Reddit stuff we've been talking about, you could kind of say it's probably somewhat chronologically oriented. So there is that. A lot of texts are in terms of their production, but that's not necessarily how you would read them. It doesn't make sense to do that. Some of them are networked. So for example, if you're looking at one of the big public dumps of large collections of texts was when Enron, during the Enron scandal, a lot of these emails got dumped. It's happening again similarly with the Epstein documents. You've got millions in this case of emails connected to one another, but there's not really an order you would read them in. You might bounce around among them, or you might kind of sort through them in some way, but there isn't sort of a linear process from one to the other. Where do you begin? When do you stop? At the scale, where do you find what you might be interested in? And so topic modeling is a way of mapping your way through that a little bit. It's if you can create a topic model, you can get some feeling for the kinds of patterns that we were looking for on the qualitative side, perhaps. Although you're doing this at a fairly the model produces a fairly statistical answer. You're not getting at meaning, at least for now, in most topic modeling. You're basically trying to get slices of the data and find some way of addressing questions or exploring that data and finding what might be useful or might be interesting to dive into in more detail. So I want to briefly go over some of the steps that you would use to do this. I don't want to go into the details of it, because although there is a tool that you can use that might make some of this easier, it also separates you from the process itself. So I won't go into the details, and I probably won't talk about particular modeling approaches, but I do want to give you a feeling for what this looks like and how you might use it. So the basic problem here is one of scale. No single human or even group of humans can read through very large collections. I gave you an example of looking through several thousand newspaper articles and kind of doing a traditional quantitative coding, content analysis coding of those newspaper articles with a handful of people working on it. I've done that with a number of things where we have a large enough group of people working on it, or we have a sample that's small enough that we can go through and hand code things. I've also kind of tried to automate that in some small ways, looking for particular key phrases, for example. But at some point you get so large you don't know what to do with it all. I've done some work, for example, on newspaper articles covering a presidential elections in the United States over large chunks of time and how they may have changed. Colleagues have done things where they've looked at discussions of particular policies in newspapers as well. And when you're looking at thousands or tens of thousands of articles, we're not going to be able to read that. It would take us years to get through it. We can read some of them, but then how do you choose which ones to read? So we kind of try to sample, we search, we kind of can rely on metadata, or we just kind of guess at what's best. They're not wrong answers, but they are partial, and they mean that we're not really getting a good cut of the entirety, because we just can't do that as a human being. So topic modeling kind of steps in here as a way of mapping the space. Sometimes in my own dissertation, I looked at maps that looked like maps, that looked like actual terrains, and people have played with that a bit with topics as well. But here we're talking mostly about kind of slicing this very large knot. As an Alexander, I appreciate the ability to slice through a knot. So slicing through, this knot of a collection and saying, are there pieces that we can pull out of this that help us to navigate our way through this large collection? Okay, that's a lot of words, but what are we actually talking about here? And although topic models might seem a little difficult to understand from the outset, they're really pretty straightforward. And that is, you're looking for a statistical model of key term co-occurrence, right? So let's say you have an article that mentions the same keywords frequently enough. That article probably goes in one bucket, right? So often, depending on the approach you take, but often when you're doing this kind of clustering, you say, I want 8 buckets, and I want you to sort these into those 8 buckets. Pretty straightforward. How is the computer going to do that? It doesn't really understand what the meaning of those are, at least for now. But it doesn't understand what the meanings of each of these documents are, but it can look at the occurrence of particular key phrases, and then it can say some of these are more likely to land in one bucket or another. That's probably the easiest way to talk about that. So for example, if I have one that talks about tacos, if I'm looking at emails and I have a one that comes up with tacos, sandwiches, pizza, lunchtime, noon, 1 o'clock, join, these are probably emails that people are sending around talking about lunch. If I have one that talks about payment, overdue, new estimate, some of these key phrases, it's probably something about a bid or a budget, right? And so I can kind of say these are general areas that these probably fit together. It doesn't really matter what that collection is. It's just they tend to show up together in documents more often than they cross documents. We might talk about a budget for lunch, I suppose, but that's far less frequent than these showing up in the same document. So it's looking for those kind of mathematical regularities. It's really important to note that even though I'm concluding this with thematic analysis, topics are not the same as themes. It's really just a distribution of words. It's not really a theme. We try to attach a theme to it often afterwards because it's helpful. And a document is not a single topic. So documents are, when you decide which of these buckets to throw them in, you're going with the one that is closest. But, we're going to get together and talk about a new bid over lunch. That's probably going to hit pretty close to the line between the lunch bucket and the budget bucket, right? So that's true of almost all of these. They're not really, you're forcing them into a bucket in order to do this distribution. The most widely, and I don't want to get too much into the particular algorithms because it's the same as these are basically unsupervised machine learning algorithms, all of them. And like any of the other machine learning algorithms, what I say this week is going to change next week. That said, the most popular approach today remains something called latent dirichlet allocation, LDA. You don't need to know what a dirichlet is. It's basically what you're doing is a Bayesian approach here that says, how will we expect this distribution to look, and then how does this particular document differ from that expectation is I guess the shortest way to describe that. And so the idea behind this is that topics generate words, documents are a combination of those topics, and the patterns we see come out of that generative process. And so it's kind of like a way of building that expectation into a machine and seeing what kind of distribution you get out of it when you do that. So that's a very broad description of what's happening. What does that mean from a practical perspective? Well, for those of you who've had some version of 5.10, at least that I'm familiar with, you've probably gone through the early steps of this already. If we want to do a step-by-step here, we would kind of take the large collection, we'd break it into tokens. Usually these are words, right? And we would remove the stop words. We might do some stemming so that we kind of do standard types of words, lowercase everything. We've done all this before. It's the same kinds of things you're doing whenever you're prepping something to go into a machine learning model. Then you kind of have to, it's worth noting that this is, I'm not aware of an approach that doesn't take a bag of words approach, so it doesn't really matter within a document where the words appear. We're using this as a general statistical collection of words within it, sort of as a bag of words. So we lose things like syntax or irony or forms of narrative or forms of argumentation or responses. All that goes out the window. We're just looking at appearances of particular tokens at certain levels. And then we go through a training of the model and we make sure that we are reaching some sort of convergence and we test it and we make sure that our tested model comes across and hits some arbitrary level of expectation. And you often, depends on which approach you're taking, but you will often determine ahead of time how many different topics you want the system to generate. So the buckets that you're putting things in, you won't say what's going into those buckets, but you'll say, can you make 10 or 15 different buckets that you're going to sort these into? It's worth noting that the model there is no correct number for that. You may try it at different levels to see kind of how these are splitting up, but there's no obvious way to do this. You kind of are giving it something to throw it into buckets and seeing what it comes up with, right? And it doesn't really determine what those topics are. Really what it's doing is it's just cutting things apart. And you can run the same model multiple times, and because this is a probabilistic distribution, you may not actually get the same collection if you run it again. It's a non-deterministic process. This is true of a bunch of different machine learning approaches and also other mathematical approaches like multidimensional scaling of various things can be, depending on how it's seeded, might end up with very different kinds of distributions. So those two things should kind of raise some flags for you around questions of, if it's non-deterministic, is this a reliable sort of approach? Does this give you a reliable set of differences among different groups? And the answer is probably not, and that's probably the wrong way to be using it. Again, if you're using it as a map to say, okay, these appear to be some differences, what can we do with that? Then it might be useful. Once you have the output, you probably have a couple of things. You have a list of topics where each topic is kind of, depending on the output, you can kind of say, these are the words that seem to be the most determinant of this topic. So you don't get something that it doesn't produce, on any of the algorithms we're using right now, it doesn't produce something that says, this is about lunch. But it does give you sort of the words that, the words that make the most difference. And so often you'll have something, I'll be honest, and I don't use this that often, but when I have used it, it's very obvious what most of the buckets are. And then you'll have your one where it's like, is this the everything else? Because it may make sense statistically, but as a human, I have no idea why all this stuff is in this bucket. It's like the junk drawer of a topic. But often you can kind of go through and look through this and say, okay, I can see both what these topics are. I have a general idea of what the topic is, and then I can look at the documents and say, okay, this particular document, this news article stick with my exemplars. This is 20% budget related and 80% lunch related, right? So that I can kind of get a feeling for how individual documents within the collection might be falling into those particular topics. So again, topics are not the same as themes because themes have meaning from the outset. That's where you're trying to get at it. But it is a way of engaging in a kind of exploration, especially with a very large collection of texts. So you didn't used to see this very often, and now I think it's overused in the literature. And often, I think too much meaning is put into what ends up being the topic model. There are certain things where it's, I think, very, very useful. So I'm interested in kind of the literature over time within certain fields. And so if I want to see, between 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, what the major themes are in a particular field. This does a really nice job of saying, okay, here's how each of those years splits up, or you can do it with the whole and then see how things shift in terms of interest over time through that. I think for something like that, it's such a neat fit that it is actually useful as not just a exploratory, but an analytical tool. But I think that it tends to be overused. And I think people often lean on it a little too heavily with the assumption that whatever these kinds of broad clusters are, that these have been interpreted in some strictly meaningful way, when it could simply be that it is, again, you're drawing this from a bunch of words without the syntax, without the context. And I think it's a very rough kind of courtroom sketch of what the entire corpus looks like. And, you haven't saved yourself from doing the reading. You still have to go into these and actually think about themes if you're doing this. Now, you do have a slight advantage here, which is that if you have a million different documents, and you've done this, and they're now in separate buckets, you can choose 100 from each bucket and feel like you might be getting a little bit better distribution of what you're reading. So it can help in that way. It can help you kind of figure out how topics might overlap or not overlap. So there are some helpful things here, but they don't substitute for the kinds of interpretive work you would do with close reading. They don't substitute for the kind of hypothesis-based content analysis you do for extracting data, even automatically needed but at scale, that answer particular questions. But they do provide sort of a map of the territory, and that can be useful, more useful in some questions than in others, but still a useful approach to understanding large collections of texts.